Hello, everyone.
Hi, Katie.
Hello, Margot.
Hey, Katie.
Hello, Alex. I guess I'll wait for like 2 more minutes just to see if people join in last minute. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining it. It's nice to see all your faces. I guess we can get started, and then if people come in, I can let them in, and I can just do introductions right now. So thank you all for coming to this Global Perspective Student Live on Travel and Tourism. My name is Katie Latham, and I'm a peer advisor for the Office of Study Abroad. For the talk today, I'm joined by Jonathan Key from CIE Amsterdam and Melanie Dumont from Bond Maroc in New Orleans. So thank you all for joining us. For the next hour, just to give you a bit of an overview, I have a couple of questions for each of the panelists that will last about 20 to 30 minutes. And then we will open it up for general questions from the audience. We encourage you all to participate in this discussion and engage in a meaningful way. In order to do this, you can ask questions by unmuting yourself or typing in the chat box. While the conversation will primarily be in English, feel free to ask in any language you want. We want everyone to feel welcome. So let's get started. So just to give you an introduction to the topic, so just like everything, life after COVID for the tourism industry is uncertain. Tourism is one of the fastest growing industries in the world, and in 2019, there are around 1.9 billion tourists. This industry has become a substantial source of income for countries around the world, but this growth does not come without consequences. Issues like over-tourism and its environmental consequences have introduced movements like flight shaming and a call for ecotourism. So once it is safe to travel again, tourists have the ability to reconstruct the industry in a new way that respects the environment and prioritizes cultural appreciation. So that's just to give a bit of an overview, and then we'll have each of the panelists just give an introduction to themselves. So I can start with Melanie.
Hi, everyone. I went to Tulane for my undergraduate degree in history and graduated in 2015. So I first came to New Orleans in 2011 and moved back for like a year, but came back after that. So I've essentially been living here for the past 8 years, and I've been working within the public relations sector in the city, which interacts heavily with restaurants, businesses like shops, arts museums, and all sorts of different cool stuff in the city. So literally I'm paid to read the newspaper and stalk things that are happening, and it's great. I really enjoy interacting with the city this way. So yeah, that's pretty much it.
Great, thank you. And then we can have Jonathan.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Key, and I'm the Center Director of CIEE's Amsterdam Study Center. So as Center Director, I'm in charge of a team of study abroad professionals that every single year, or I should say every single year prior to 2020, hosted around 500 to 600 American college-aged and high school students for a variety of different study abroad programs, varying in length from just a week to a full year study abroad experience in the Netherlands. I'm a passionate supporter of study abroad, but in many ways, study abroad can contribute to those same dynamics of over-tourism that you just talked about, Katie. So I'm definitely mindful of the fact that we as study abroad providers and those students that go on those study abroad programs actually play a role in contributing to some of those harmful effects that are synonymous with over-tourism.
All right, thank you both. So for the first question, and feel to answer in whichever order you want. But before COVID-19, what was the general attitude towards travel? Was there any emphasis on being more sustainable? And so we can, I guess, give it to more of like a New Orleans perspective and then a Netherlands perspective.
Yeah, sure thing. So As you can imagine, New Orleans puts a lot of financial and political energy behind becoming one of the main tourist destinations within our country. It kind of started back after the Civil War around the 1870s, when New Orleans tried to pride itself as being this fun, cool, picturesque, post-Civil War Southern utopia, which had its own issues incorporated with that, but really, started to make itself into a destination. We see the rise of Storyville as a local and national hotspot, as a kind of permanent red light district, which essentially started off New Orleans's reputation in the modern era as this place of fun and frivolity. And you go there and it's like essentially Las Vegas of the South. Now, as we continue on through World War I in 1920, the US Navy actively shut down Storyville because it was giving too many of their military members STDs, and they just didn't want to have to deal with that during the war effort. And so after that, New Orleans decided to kind of reshift how it was made and how it interacted as a tourist destination. Even before many destinations weren't essentially fermented as such within the country. And so you see the rise of Bourbon Street as kind of overtaking this identity of Storyville. Now that brothels aren't allowed anymore, they essentially shifted to more of a bar nightlife industry that you see today as it has developed over the past century. Now, starting in the 1960s, New Orleans decided to kind of permanently make a Department of Tourism to help bring more and more folk in throughout the city. Even during the civil rights movement, it was continued to be seen as this like perfect, picturesque, like Southern plantation home, like beautiful architecture, like French and Spanish history kind of epicenter of the region. And many other cities within the Gulf South decided to essentially let New Orleans take that role. And so they wanted to kind of continue to stay more isolated for various different reasons. But in the 1960s, you see the emergence of Mardi Gras as not just like a few days and a few private parties and a few neighborhood-centric parades, but you see the emergence of super cruise, like with the Bacchus, I think, being the first one in 1968. You see a large portion of newly wealthy people within the city kind of creating their own organizations that they have been barred from say Rex of that same era. And so you see an influx of the oil industry come in, the hospitality industry is born, the Saints were created in I think 1967, and the Superdome was built around that same time too. So you see this huge push towards utilizing that money that they got from the oil industry into creating this hospitality sector. Now in the 1970s and 80s, you see kind of a shift in focus from oil, as you see with the 1970s oil crisis. And they took that money and then shoved it into hospitality even more. So many of the names that you see that are kind of the historic epicenters of food, museums, everything like that was really solidified kind of within that time frame. Now, over those 60 years, you'll see that 50% of the population of the French Quarter moved elsewhere and were replaced by businesses in kind of essentially what we know of as gentrification. And so since then, it's just really continued to be kind of like a highlight as a tourist destination within the Gulf South. Katrina really did, put itself as a benchmark in terms of measuring where New Orleans was at that point and how we've been seeing the city evolve over the past 13 years, whether that be for good or for bad. So at the time of Katrina, not to like hyper focus on Katrina, but the population of the city was about, I think, like 480,000. And we still haven't gotten back to that level yet since the hurricane. There was a whole lot of displacement. I think in the region, there were 1 million people who were displaced by the storm. And a few of like a large percentage like have been able to return in some fashion, but also there are now permanent communities of displaced New Orleanians across the entire country. But with that, we lost a lot of housing, and with the start of kind of Airbnb and kind of different gig economy type industries, you'll see a lot of space that was originally taken up by residents has now been essentially transformed into another part of the hospitality industry. Meanwhile, in New Orleans, we see a huge gap in inequity in terms of its residents. New Orleans, as you may or may not know, is 60% Black. And although they are the majority of the city, you see a lot of the wealth and a lot of the power still remaining in essentially this old rich white guard. Or you see a lot of people post-Katrina coming in from across the country to capitalize on New Orleans as a city. So yeah, even in the past 10 years that I've lived here, like I feel like the vibe of New Orleans has changed. You see a lot more kind of chic, metropolitan, millennial industries popping up, and that can be great. I mean, the city has really exploded in terms of visitor growth. I think in 2009 there were 9 million visitors, and last year in 2018, 2019 there were 18 million. So year after year, we're seeing incredible growth in both visitor spending and visitors to the city as well. But yet, even with that growth, we're still not seeing any inequity gap closing at this point. So yeah, it's definitely interesting going into COVID with all of that knowledge. New Orleans has felt like it's been in this like weird snowball of really focusing its industry on hospitality. And while that is great, it has a lot of negatives, as we've seen over the past year, and also just in general in terms of the health and prosperity of the people who live within the city itself. So that's that.
Thank you. That's great. Okay, Jonathan.
Thank you so much. First of all, it just strikes me that there are so many parallels between our two cities, between New Orleans on the one hand and Amsterdam on the other hand. Bill O'Reilly, late from Fox News, once famously described Amsterdam as Sodom and Gomorrah realized. So that reputation of a city where everything is allowed, where there's this air of permissibility, a city that is synonymous with sex and drugs and illicit behavior. In many ways, that is part and parcel of the reputation of the city of Amsterdam. And in the same way that New Orleans for a time built that into its calling card for sort of visitors, both domestically and internationally, the same has happened to the city of Amsterdam. There are a couple of noticeable differences. Amsterdam didn't become a tourism destination until the second half of the 20th century. So in many ways, this is a much more recent phenomenon. For the first half of the 20th century, Amsterdam was a fairly sleepy capital. The Netherlands has two capitals, unique situation in and of itself. So it wasn't necessarily a tourism destination at the time. The very first canal cruise in Amsterdam didn't happen until 1914. So these are all very recent developments in the city. A couple of things converged, and they converged around the same time period that Melanie referred to, the 1960s. The 1960s was really an inflection point in Amsterdam in terms of the reputation of the city. That was primarily due at the time due to local phenomena, so national phenomena. We saw a civil rights movement in Amsterdam or in the Netherlands, and Amsterdam became the headquarter, sort of the laboratory, the focal point of that movement in Amsterdam. And the reputation of Amsterdam as a free haven, as a place where radical thinkers could come together and sort of think about and design the city and society of the future, that reputation was only cemented in the 1960s in Amsterdam and nationally before it was then exported abroad. So this is really a much more recent phenomenon, but from the very beginning, it was built on these pillars of free thinking and civil rights. Specifically for Amsterdam, we're talking about three elements of its reputation that have endured until today. The first is Amsterdam as a gay capital. This is a huge part of its international reputation, and the city of Amsterdam invested a lot of money and cultural capital in framing the city of Amsterdam as this queer capital, as the gay European capital. You may have seen pictures of the Amsterdam Canal Parade, where we don't just have floats in the traditional sense of the words, ours actually float. We have them in the canal belt, and it's one of the biggest attractions and events every single year. The second is legalized prostitution. The Netherlands was one of the first countries in the world to legalize prostitution. And in many ways, the city of Amsterdam has become synonymous with that red light district. And the red light district, until this day today, remains one of the key areas in terms of when we measure where tourists go and the places that tourists visit, it's really concentrated in that red light district. And then thirdly, we have the legalization of soft drugs. So Amsterdam is a capital for cannabis, has given rise to what is now derisively called blow tourism, where we have a lot of tourists. Those are primarily European tourists, many tourists who come from the United Kingdom and who come from Germany specifically and exclusively to go to what we call coffee shops. The city of Amsterdam invested a lot of resources in sort of building and cementing that reputation and then exporting it. And that's given rise to a very rapid increase in terms of tourism. So just to give you a little bit of a sense, by the year 1999, when sort of Y2K hit, the city hit a high in terms of tourists, and that was 4.2 million tourists a year. In 2019, we had 19 million tourists a year. So we've seen a really rapid increase in terms of the number, and not just the number of tourists, but the number of nights that those tourists stay in Amsterdam. In the year 2000, that hit a high of 8 million. The latest figures that we have for 2019 are 21 million hotel stays in a year. Amsterdam is a small city, and the inner city is even smaller. Amsterdam is home to about 850,000 people, but the inner city, which tends to be where tourists not only arrive, but stay for the duration of their visit, is only home to about 90,000 people. So if you have an influx of millions of tourists who all circulate in an extremely small part of the city, then that creates a lot of stress. And it creates a lot of irritation on the part of people who live in that city center. So on the one hand, we have a rise of anti-tourism, and we see this in other European cities, most pronounced, I would say probably in cities like Venice and Barcelona, where there's been a real sort of blowback against tourists. But on the other hand, and this is something Melanie also pointed to, the city has come to rely on the influx of money into the city and into the country. Tourism in the Netherlands accounts for about 40 billion in terms of direct and indirect money that flows into the country. And Amsterdam is responsible for well over a third of those tourism dollars or euros. And COVID has hit the city extremely hard. If you only look at the tourism tax, which is a tax that tourists need to pay as soon as they check into a hotel, there's a tax that's levied. Just the tax accounts for 140 million euros that the city has lost in since COVID-19. So since March, 129 million euros that the city does not have, which means that it has had to completely redraw its budget and will have to cut the budget across the board. So the city has become extremely reliant on tourism at the same time that we saw this explosive growth and a real sense that the city was headed in the wrong direction. That all came to sort of a pivot point in 2018 when the city destroyed and dismantled the famous I Amsterdam sign. This was one of the most famous places in Amsterdam. This big I Amsterdam sign was taken apart by the city center, and it was seen as a symbolic act that would sort of inaugurate a new era of thinking about tourism. A real shift away from Amsterdam as this Sodom and Gomorrah that attracts visitors who are primarily looking to engage in sort of sexual acts or contribute to drug tourism, to what is now being referred to as quality tourism. And that's exactly what Melanie was talking about too. So we're seeing a shift to what are called high quality tourists. So those are tourists who would come to Amsterdam to go to conferences, to go to the museum district, to visit the 17th century canal belt. So a real shift away from those patterns of tourism that really contributed to sort of those harmful effects of over tourism.
All right, thank you both for those very thorough and interesting backgrounds. I was wondering if we have any questions before we move on to the next question. Yeah, go ahead, Bianca. No, you can type it in the, wait, try again. Want to type it in the chat, maybe?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Awesome. This is a question for Melanie, and I might have missed a bit of what you said, but when you were talking about the oil industry, like in relation to tourism in New Orleans, I'm just curious, like, so do you think that without the oil industry and without like the amount of wealth that Louisiana has managed to get from that, New Orleans would have been able to develop such a robust tourism industry, or do you think that it was like really interdependent?
So a little backstory, I'm from Mobile, Alabama, which during the 19th century was essentially a sister city to New Orleans. We were both very integral ports in the Gulf of Mexico and still kind of continue to be. And Alabama does have a little bit of oil industry. But I've noticed, I think, for the past 200 years or so, New Orleans has really just exploded in terms of growth. I think its proximity to Texas and its proximity, of course, to the Mississippi River has definitely helped it in that regard. I mean, like literally most water in the United States flows through the Mississippi River. So you'll get a lot of, business essentially, both geographically and, everything else coming through New Orleans. I do think that in the Gulf South, you have a lot of money that has been tied to kind of old, out of fashion industries. I mean, New Orleans, Mobile, Atlanta, Charleston, all of these southern cities were heavily boosted by the plantation economy. But since the Civil War and since that has kind of redeveloped in other things and transformed into different things, I think really just in my unprofessional opinion, oil really was a factor in helping New Orleans take some of that tax money and then redevelop it into something more directed towards tourism. Whereas like Mobile, on the other hand, it went through a lot of economic shortfalls in terms of fires that plagued the town, but specifically as a port during World War I and World War II, it really increased kind of the energy within the city in terms of population growth, in terms of just kind of the basic economy that was tied to the war. But after the wars ended and the ports kind of closed up, they didn't really have anything to fall back on. And no one really knows where Mobile is unless you're in the Gulf Coast, but everybody knows where New Orleans is. So that's my best answer. But I really do think that, oil still has a huge stranglehold on Louisiana in terms of its kind of statewide government and funding. And then also, like, if you just go through the city, like if you go to Jazz Fest is, sponsored by Shell. You have a lot of these kind of educational institutions that are funded by oil. You have a lot of kind of business operations that are in partnership with oil companies. So it definitely, I think, is a significant part of the industry. And without it, I don't know where New Orleans would be today, sadly or positively. It's a difficult thing to untangle the oil industry from New Orleans.
Great. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Oh, yeah, Rosie?
Yeah, I have a question for Jonathan. What else has been done, if anything, in Amsterdam to kind of decrease the tourists that are just coming to go to the coffee shops or to go to the red light district?
That's a great question, because right before COVID, there were actually two initiatives and two developments that were playing themselves out. One, which is a strategy that every other city in the Netherlands has adopted, but Amsterdam resisted, was to make coffee shops places where you needed to show a Dutch ID in order to be able to enter. It was called the I criterion. The city of Amsterdam resisted it because it realized, and it knows, and it did a lot of research into the tourists, who they are, what their composition is, and why they come to Amsterdam. And there are many tourists who cite as their number 1 and 2 reasons visiting the coffee shops and visiting the red light district, and ideally doing both at the same time, which you can do because there are a lot of coffee shops in the red light district. So the city is currently looking into, and is forced to look into, the possibility of making coffee shops prohibiting people who do not have a Dutch nationality from entering those coffee shops. They have to because the citizens stepped in. So under Dutch law, if you have a petition that accrues X number of signatures, the city council has to officially take it up. And just in June, so June of this year, a petition was launched in the city of Amsterdam. It needed to get 11,000 signatures in order to be officially taken up. As of today, it has over 30,000. So the city has to officially consider doing that. Number 2, and this is a much longer development, is to move the red light district. So to take the red light district and to move it outside of the city of Amsterdam. That's been under consideration for a very long time. In many ways, the city of Amsterdam is somewhat hypocritically much more concerned about the economic impact of closing down those coffee shops or making them less available to international guests. It's much happier, unfortunately, to move the red light district. We're no longer in the 1960s. That sexual openness has in many ways made way for a sort of new, more enlightened Puritanism. So the city of Amsterdam is much less invested in keeping the red light district open. It's much less concerned about the fate of those sex workers who rely on the red light district to make a living than it is about the economic impact of closing down those coffee shops. So those are two things that the city of Amsterdam is currently considering. The third, and this is something it has already done, and there is a lot of evidence into this, is Airbnbs, which Melanie also mentioned, and which have been a huge bane to the city of Amsterdam. Currently, there are 3 sections of the city center, and these are the most visited sections of the city center where Airbnbs are outlawed. This is again as of this summer. So there is a ban on Airbnbs in those parts of the city center. What the city has also done, and this it did in 2019, was to limit the number of nights that an Airbnb or a property can function as an Airbnb. There used to be no limit. In 2015, they limited it to 60 nights per year. And then last year, they limited it to just 30 nights per year. So they've really cracked down on Airbnbs, which the city sees as a major contributor to not just over tourism, but to what is being called extractive tourism, where visitors just come to consume, and don't actually give back, where it's not a type of more productive, engaged tourism. So in terms of cracking down on what's called, peer-to-peer holiday rentals, which is primarily Airbnb, the city has done a great deal.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions before we move on? Okay. So for the next question, just kind of going off of that, how do you see coronavirus kind of impacting travel and tourism and kind of that history? Like, what do you think will be the history of tourism, not history, the future of tourism in these cities, and kind of like a touch on sustainability? Do you see there are other ways that we could kind of rebuild the tourism industry in a more sustainable way?
Yeah, well, I guess I'll talk about kind of my experience kind of interacting with a lot of the clients that we have on a regular basis. Before COVID, we represented a lot of restaurant groups. We were about to open a new kind of museum experience pop-up thing. We had a lot of kind of small businesses that also reach out to us to do kind of pinch hitting stuff or doing public relations outreach. So just as a quick refresher for people who might not know, I specifically focus on public relations, which is earned media. And so that means what I do on a daily basis is I take information about events or kind of newsworthy things from my clients, and then I reach out personally to reporters, both either like locally, regionally, or nationally, to try to see if I can get placement in the news without essentially spending anything. Once you start spending something, then that shifts into marketing. So that means like ad placement in a newspaper. If you see sponsored posts, that's marketing. And so it's an industry that has a lot of moving pieces. Number one, we have to have clients who are able to pay for our services. So this means usually most of the companies that we interact with in New Orleans have kind of a strong financial basis in order to do this out of house as opposed to in-house. And that can be like social media management, it could be event planning, it could be a range of different things. And with that, once we have that client, they need to have the money to essentially make something newsworthy, whether that be a partnership with a nonprofit and they're running a thing, or like they're opening a new restaurant, or any sort of fun, flashy thing like that. And then from then, we take that information, compile it together, and then we reach out to the media. And this could mean that they could accept our news story, or they could say, no, that we're not going to talk about that unless you want to like pay for space and pay for, this newspaper, then we don't have room in that because we don't feel like it serves a public good. So when coronavirus happened, we had a lot of events that were on the docket. It was just past Mardi Gras, and so we had a huge busy season during that as well. With the tourism that comes into the city, every business is trying to finagle both interacting with Mardi Gras in a way that locals do versus getting attention from the public and a massive amount of visitors who are coming in and trying to capitalize on that as much as possible. When COVID started hitting, first thing to fall were essentially our clients. They realized that with the shutdown that they were going to have to close down for 2 weeks, a month, something like that. And a lot of businesses, are suggested to have months to a year of savings built up, but with an industry such as that, it's often difficult to do. So the first thing they cut are public relations. And they just kind of focus on making sure that they can retain their employees. So a lot of our clients essentially said, we're going to just close up shop, and 2 months from now, we'll reach back out to you when we know that we have some money coming in from visitors or from locals or anything like that. For the clients that we did keep, they essentially scaled back on all marketing efforts and PR efforts. Again, events take money to run. And so if there's nothing for us to piece together for them and talk about, there's nothing for us to bring to the media to then kind of showcase all of these efforts. So very quickly we saw a lot of businesses cut back, a lot of businesses fire employees, or just put them essentially on permanent furlough. It was kind of terrifying internally with our business, since we're so tied to the hospitality industry in that way. we didn't know what to do. Like, we were all freaking out. And a lot of the restaurants we were talking to, they were freaking out, and we thought it was just going to be like a month or 2 months of a shutdown. Then we would return, and hopefully levels would be so low with coronavirus that we wouldn't have to worry too much. Sure, we might lose a few clients here and there, but 2 months and this is all over. As y'all have been able to tell, numbers are still high in New Orleans. As we've been reaching out for the clients that are trying to put on socially distanced events, essentially so many regional and national publications are refusing to cover New Orleans. And I think, you know, as on the one hand, as well they should. I personally don't think that people should be participating in cross-country travel right now, especially coming to a city that has such a vulnerable population. So there's that. But also in the same time, like, since Louisiana has literally the worst unemployment insurance, people are losing things. They're losing their homes. They can't feed themselves. This is going to have such an economical just devastation that it's essentially Katrina level. Except the thing is with Katrina is it was a storm. It came through. There was a lot of permanent damage that was had. You know, a lot of people moved out of the city and didn't come back within the year. But it was kind of a 2-day event in terms of the storm damage, and then the damage that continued on after that, specifically within New Orleans. And then people were able to pick up the pieces again. With coronavirus, we're still in it. It's 8 months later. Businesses are allowed to open to a varying degrees, but you know, it's constantly changing. We just entered phase 3.2 tomorrow, I guess, and there are only a few changes that happen within that. But it's just been 8 months of uncertainty, and especially within an industry that is so heavily reliant on hospitality, and the people who work for these restaurants, these museums, these stores, they're making minimum wage. And, you know, if you're a millionaire and you lose $20,000, oh, darn, you can still feed yourself. But a lot of residents within New Orleans have nothing to fall back on, and this is devastating. So it's going to be interesting as we go forward. Already, I mean, ever since May, literally, we've had regional visitors coming to New Orleans, not to any level that we've been used to. One of my clients is a shopping mall in the area, and so they, you know, were talking to people who were coming in as soon as they were allowed to open, I think June 16th or something. And people were saying that they traveled in from Alabama to come shop there because they just wanted to get out of the house. So there, you know, numbers are rising every week for people coming in to shop. Spending per visitor is very high compared to what it was pre-corona, but it's still really difficult. And going forward, I hope that the city tries to take that money, or take this opportunity, I guess, to really refocus on what they want to highlight or what they want to market and to spend money on, and take this as an opportunity to kind of diversify the economy and help its local population, but also just considering how the city treated Katrina and its after effects as a way to rebirth itself in a way that seemed more palatable to a national visitor audience. I don't have a whole lot of faith in the city preventing that from happening again. So I don't know. It's hands up in the air at this point. We'll see, I guess, over the coming months. But yeah, so that's my story of the past 8 months in New Orleans.
Great, we can go on to the Netherlands.
Sure. Again, I see a lot of parallels between Amsterdam and New Orleans. I will have to say, just speaking frankly and speaking on behalf of many people in Amsterdam, the initial response was a huge sigh of relief. So a lot of people in Amsterdam felt that they had finally caught a break and that the city had been returned to them. And that was sort of the sense that a lot of Amsterdammers had, especially those Amsterdammers who live in the historic city center, who felt in many ways that it was no longer theirs, that it existed for tourists, primarily for tourists, that it catered primarily to tourists. And if you live in the city center of the city, that's not just a feeling, that's also a spatial reality. So businesses leave the city center and are replaced by waffle shops, by ice cream stores, by those sort of horrible like tourist paraphernalia stores, where even the businesses no longer cater to the people who actually live in Amsterdam, but cater only to those tourists. And then of course there's the constant physical presence of tourists, which for many people who live in the city center used to mean that they would have to snake their way through throngs of tourists in order to get to the grocery store, in order to pick up their kid from daycare. So it initially, for the first couple of months, there was a rediscovering of the city of Amsterdam. And this is something that I experienced myself. I don't live in the city center, I live just outside of it, which is where most people in Amsterdam live. We avoid the city center. Pre-corona, if you don't need to be in the city center, you don't go to the city center because it's so hard to navigate. But the city center is beautiful, right? It has that 17th century canal belt. It has this amazing architecture. It has all of these buildings that really capture the spirit of the city. And for many people in Amsterdam, there was a true sense of seeing the city through a new pair of eyes, seeing it in a way that they had never seen it before. So that was the initial reaction. I already talked about the fact that the economic impact on the city was severe and was immediate. We saw a grinding to a screeching halt of all international tourism. And then in sort of staggered ways, European tourism as well. We've seen a 75% decrease in hotel stays, 75%. We're talking about an industry that in the city of Amsterdam alone employs close to 100,000 people. So a lot of those people were let go. Thankfully, the Netherlands, like many other Western European countries, has a socialist democratic tradition, which means that it believes in strong workers' rights and workers' protections. So the Dutch government does provide businesses with fairly generous payroll protection programs with the express purpose of ensuring that that people are kept on the payroll as long as possible. That said, since March, we've seen an increase in unemployment in the city of Amsterdam of 55%. And tourism is one of the top 3 hardest hit sectors in the city of Amsterdam. Many people in sort of, I would say, this new phase of sort of coming to terms with the fact that, like Melanie mentioned, this is not going to be a temporary phenomenon. We're going to be living with COVID and with the after effects of COVID for years, plural, to come. Many people are seeing it as a reset. Let's finally reset what our tourism policy is going to be, what tourism is going to mean for us, what actions we as a city and we as inhabitants are going to take. When the money is coming in, it's hard to make changes. When the money stops, when it dries up, you're also freed, you're untethered, and you're able to actually look around and say, what should we be doing? There's 2 initiatives that I briefly want to talk about that I think are really promising. The first is one that was set up by a part of the city of Amsterdam that is never visited by tourists. This is a huge problem. They tend to cluster together in a really teeny tiny part of the city. Like Melanie talked about as well, Amsterdam is a deeply segregated city. The inner city is where white people live. It's where white well-to-do people live. The outer neighborhoods are underserved, are underprivileged, and are home primarily to Amsterdammers of color. Those Amsterdammers of color work in the hospitality industry, so they were hit, but they were doubly hit by the fact that they were never the direct beneficiaries of those tourism dollars. Those all went into the historic city center. So a number of local activist groups in that different part of the city have said, why don't we actively redirect tourists? Why don't we find ways to ensure that we put this part of Amsterdam on the radar and we get tourists to spend their euros here instead? There's a couple of really great sort of examples of this. Where Brixton, which is this underserved neighborhood in London, designed and built a new nightlife scene, like basically an entertainment district in this completely underserved part of London, and was able to make that work. So there are ways in which you can do that, but the city needs to invest in it. So there needs to be an investment in those parts of the city. The second initiative is what's called the Amsterdam Passport. So this is an idea that's been floated and that, again, the city council is currently considering. Tourism has been extremely hard hit, but the cultural sector has faced and is facing an even more impossible situation. Because while businesses are able to rely on Dutch visitors, the cultural sector is currently, for all intents and purposes, defunct. No international visitors, but also no Dutch visitors. The cultural sector is heavily reliant on subsidies. Those are drying up. A theater right now is just unable to bring in any money or to run any kind of profit. The Amsterdam Passport would require that every tourist who comes into the city of Amsterdam buy this passport. It's 50 euros, 50, but they get 5 coupons for 10 euros each. But the city decides what those coupons are good for. So you can have 10 euros go to a cultural institution that really depends on that money, but that your standard tourists, those blow tourists, wouldn't go to. But the only way the city would be incentivizing that they go to those institutions. And you could also add places, spaces, institutions that are located outside of the city center to ensure that the money actually flows to local initiatives. So the Amsterdam Passport is a great way in which you could sort of try and affect change by hitting 2 birds with one stone. So those are 2 initiatives that I think are really promising and speak to the fact that the city, all stakeholders, citizens, tourism organizations, the municipality are rethinking what tourism should look like post-COVID.
Yeah, I agree. Those initiatives both sound really great. I was wondering if we have any questions from the audience again. Andrew? Yeah.
The absolutely fascinating. The Amsterdam Passport is something that in the immediate aftermath of Katrina, some folks around New Orleans were trying to do something like that, as any good catastrophe should never go to waste. So in the rubble, we should be trying to prepare for the new world to come in. The general opposition that we received, over 50% of the tourists that come to New Orleans are from within a 6-hour drive. And these are some of the poorest states in America, some of the least educated states of America. The idea of giving them a coupon to go and have a cultural experience somewhere outside of 6 blocks of Bourbon Street and hand grenades and hurricanes is patently unappealing to most of them. Melanie, correct me if I'm wrong here.
People would riot.
People would riot. Yeah, exactly. And it would be a messy, sloppy, vomitous riot. It also brought up a lot of issues of equity and the idea that if you immediately charge people, maybe there are some people who do want to come to New Orleans for the flora and the fauna. They want to go and have some cultural experiences, but they absolutely don't have another $50 to shell out for the experience. So are we moving then in a stage, is a question for both of you, unfortunately, where we're making tourism in order to control the deleterious effects thereof more and more an elitist enterprise?
Yeah, I'll hop on. I think this is something that I wanted to bring up further in the discussion, but I really do think that if there's one good thing that comes out of the past 8 months, I really think that the renewed focus on civil rights within the city has been generally a positive thing. I think that more so than I have seen in the past, more reporters are focusing on businesses owned and run by people of color, specifically Black institutions within the city. That I really do enjoy. I like the internet discussion that we've been having, at least part of it. There has been, a lot of important issues that are being raised, and I think being able to see how a business reacts to kind of the national dialogue and also the local dialogue is very informative. The fact that you can just go on Google and type in like, what are amazing New Orleans locally owned businesses that are run by people of color. Like you can just Google that, and then there's an incredible list, or like multiple lists, like literally Google pages of suggestions that are more kind of, I guess, in the same strain of ethical tourism. Like you can go to Commanders and have a Commanders dinner, and that's fine, bucket list, New Orleans, whatever. But I think with Instagram and social media, you have all of these generations of people who are coming into the city who are younger and more technologically literate than ever. They can go to a place's Instagram page, see that, people are putting comments on the Instagram photos being like, wow, you really treated this employee like crap. How dare you, from like locals and stuff like that. And that is, it's bad PR. And, hopefully that will kind of shift the dynamic of focus on organizations and businesses that are essentially good, that are run by locals, that are authentic, that are I mean, authentic is an interesting dialogue to go down in. But it's definitely, it's given the ability to people to kind of think more critically about what businesses they are spending their money on. So hopefully in the future, I mean, I don't know. It's a really, really tough and interesting question that people could probably write a dissertation on. But yeah, no, I do have a lot of hope in terms of people using these tools that we have now to really spend more time and effort learning about the portions of the city that don't get the national recognition that, say, Commanders or Brennan's does, and that they can focus on kind of the businesses and the local small businesses that deserve it the most.
And just to quickly add on to that, because I think the point that you raise is an excellent one. When you look at all of the systems that are currently in place to allow for mass tourism, those are systems that have artificially made tourism much cheaper. And Amsterdam as a city has benefited from that. Primarily, we're talking about air travel, right? The fact that traveling by plane has been incentivized by governments, by deregulation of the airline industry, by the rise of those extremely cheap budget airlines. And that has made, especially travel within Europe, extremely cheap. An argument could be made that to offset the fact that these airline industries are heavily supported, I'm not sure if this is the case in the US too, but in Europe, all of the major airlines have received financial lifelines from their national governments. There was a huge uproar in the Netherlands over the fact that KLM, which is the biggest airline here, it's part of an alliance with Air France, receives and will continue to receive hundreds of millions of euros to keep that airline afloat. But at the same time, it is that cheap air travel that is making over-tourism a reality. And this is also key, contributing hugely to the deleterious effects of climate change, right? So the ecological impact of mass tourism to a large extent can be traced back to those emissions caused by plane travel. An argument could be made that the least we could do to offset that is to introduce something like the Amsterdam passport, which is 50 euros. And the genius of it is, it doesn't matter if they actually go, right? We're not actually going to be forcing those tourists to actually use those coupons. It's up to them. They just need to pay for it so that the city gets those monies and is able to then distribute them to those cultural institutions and to ensure that the money flows to underserved parts of the city. It would also be less painful for the city overall when you compare it to other alternatives. So earlier I mentioned the fact that the city is considering but dragging its feet on potentially requiring that you show a Dutch ID in order to go to a coffee shop and enable to buy and consume weed. A survey was conducted and commissioned by the city of Amsterdam of British tourists. And British tourists are our #1 group of tourists in Amsterdam. There's close to 3 million British tourists who visit Amsterdam. Over 50% of them said they would not come back ever to Amsterdam if they could not go to coffee shops. So literally that is their #1 reason of going. Again, you could make an argument that, okay, let's leave that aside, but let's do the passport, right? They still get to come, they still get to sort of partake in something that is clearly very important to them, but at least they're all paying 50 euros that will go towards those institutions that they're not visiting. So again, it's all about sort of offsets, and it's all about rebalancing what you think the priorities are or should be.
So I have a quick question about I feel like there's a lot of conversation about like reframing like what a reputation of a city is, or deciding how like what tourism should look like in a city. And I guess my question is kind of generally who gets to decide that? Like there's an element of policy in it, but I think you were talking, Melanie, about how there's also an element of like almost grassroots PR nowadays because of the use of like social media. And I was wondering if you could comment more on that and kind of how decisions that can have such a great effect on the economy of an entire city, an entire region get made.
Yeah. Oh boy, what a fun question. Who decides what New Orleans looks like to tourists, and I guess it would intrinsically to locals as well. So a lot of things go into how a city markets itself. #1, as pure baseline, like what is there? I mean, we have buildings in every city, we have geography in every city, we have, cultural makeup in every city. But really a city is formed by decades of political pushing in one way or another. If, a lobbyist comes in and they are working with government officials and they're trying to ease tax credits on a film industry to start up. They go to the state legislature, they talk with city officials, they get things done. And essentially everything that happens in the city to an extent is touched by some sort of big business. So when you have in a post-Katrina setting, you have a lot of people left the city. A lot of homes were damaged to an extreme degree. What do you have then? You have people coming in from all over the country saying, hey, let us rebuild the homes for you. Let us rebuild this for you. Let us do this. You give us a tax write-off and we'll make it happen. And you'll have pretty shiny new buildings in the city, which people can, use for this, that, and the other thing. And that's just kind of very basically glazing over things in terms of how things happen in the city. But also on a marketing level as well, New Orleans tax dollars go to their tourism department, New Orleans and Company, which has, I think it employs around 1,000 people, both in New Orleans and all over the world, in France, Germany, China. I think there's an office in South Carolina as well, in order to kind of create deals and to buy marketing for the city. So if you ever see ads for cities watching like the Super Bowl or something like that, that's part of their tourism department. City governments, will have a lot of say of like specifically how they want the city to look, with their outreach, what partnerships they want to pursue, what partnerships they don't want to pursue. It's all very, very top level. And unfortunately, I guess the only way to change that is if you start voting for different people to be included at top level discussions. And unfortunately, like it's very difficult to touch that. In terms of what I do on a regular basis, again, I'm mostly working with nonprofits, restaurants, and just like singular hotels or singular businesses that just own one kind of brick and mortar store operation. You know, they can always do outreach on a national front or regional front, and we get to kind of mold that how we want it to be. But in terms of kind of the big players within the city, it is very difficult to change that without being a political powerhouse. So, I mean, there's always the ability for people to voice their concerns, but sometimes that's more possible than others. So hold your city members, city council members accountable, interact with them as much as you can, you know, give money to businesses you want to support, tell your friends to support specific businesses and to stay away from certain areas, go out of the two-lane bubble. There are so many ways that you yourself can help this, but the bulk of it is going to be from top down.
Again, a great deal of what Melanie just said applies to the city of Amsterdam as well. When I think of what sustainable tourism means, I approach it in terms of stakeholder relationships. And I think, just like Melanie said, there hasn't been a cooperative, collaborative approach in terms of setting a tourism policy. It's been extremely top down. It's been the municipality and the city council on the one hand, and the tourism industry on the other hand. And those have been the two big players who have set a policy for tourism in Amsterdam. In the past 5 years, that has changed dramatically. And it's changed because of direct democracy, citizen-led initiatives, that petition that I talked about earlier that so quickly got the signatures it needed to be officially taken up. There is talk of a referendum, so pushing it even further and really requiring that actions are taken, because ultimately the reputation of the city of Amsterdam is one that is the result of years and years and years of extremely deliberate, thought out, PR tested, poll tested, exporting of a reputation, investing in that reputation. So it is going to take a while to sort of undo that. But I see a great deal of hope in the fact that there is now an accountability that is being demanded by the citizens of Amsterdam, and there is an opportunity that is being provided. Like you said earlier, or someone said earlier, we should never waste a crisis, and I think that's true here as well. And I think we now have sort of a reprieve to really sort of sit down, get all of those three stakeholders around the table, and actually think and rethink what the reputation is going to be and also what the policy is going to be. Interestingly, Amsterdam never had a city councillor responsible for tourism. So even though we have city councillors for every single subject under the sun, there was never one for tourism. And that's another demand that is being made now. We need a city councillor so that there's actual plans and policies that we can look at as the citizens to see what the policy is. Prior to that, the policy was PR driven. It did not exist on a piece of paper. It was something that the city and the tourism industry decided on. Now there's this real demand for transparency, and creating a city councillor's office that is dedicated to tourism means hopefully that we as citizens will have access to those plans when they're drawn up to imagine or reimagine what tourism will look like in this new reality.
Okay, I think we're gonna wrap it up there. It's pretty late for Jonathan, so we should probably let him go to bed. But thank you all for attending, and thank you panelists for joining us. Just a reminder, this is a series of events, so just be sure to check out the other events on the Office of Study Abroad office. But just wanted to thank you again, and if you guys have any questions, I can pass them on to the panelists. Just shoot me an email, and I'll send it off to them. All right, thank you all.
Good job, Katie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.